Hello everybody, welcome back to our study of Tanya, continuing with chapter 2, very fundamental chapter. So now we're going to study the second soul, the second Jewish soul, which is the godly soul. So let's get straight into it. Perek Bet, chapter 2, V'nefesh Hashenit B'Yisrael, Yichelek Eloha Mimal Mamash, the second soul of Israel is a piece of God, literally. And this indicates two opposites. On the one hand, it's a piece of God, which means it's spirituality of spirituality. And on the other hand, it actually comes into physicality of physicality. Mamash means literally. It's literally a piece of God. Literal is physical. And this is what it explains in Hayom Yom of 23rd of Menachem Av, that even though the soul, the godly soul, is from spirituality of spirituality, it has its greatness is that it's able to actually come down and have an effect on the most physical. As the verse says, that when God gave the soul into the first person, Adam, he blew into his nostrils a soul of life, which refers to the godly soul. And as we actually say in the morning prayers, that you blew into me. The Zohar explains that what's so special about blowing actually comes from a person's innards, from a person's inside. From the inside of a person, that's where you blow. There's speaking, which speaking is just breath. It's very external, it's very trivial. And blowing, when you blow with all your strength from the inside. And that's what God is saying, that this godly soul comes from the inside of God. שתוכיות ופנימיות החיות שבאדם מוציא בנפיחתו בכוח. כך על דרך משל נשמת ישראל עלו במחשבה. So now, to explain this idea that this godly soul comes from the inside of God, we're going to give a mashal, a parable that we're going to carry throughout this whole chapter. The parable is of a thought of a child. So the verse says, Israel came up in thought, meaning that the souls of the Jewish people come from God's thought, so to speak. So in thought, it in another place in Chassidus, in the Mittel Rebbe's work of Shar HaEmunah, which God willing will get to on this YouTube channel, I plan. In chapter 62, in Shar HaEmunah, he explains this idea. What does it mean that the godly soul is one with God's thought, is part of God's thought? And he says that there's two aspects of thought. There's two kinds of thought. One kind of thought is something that's external to the person. And as you see this external aspect of thought, that when you think something, you're able to go from one thought to another and switch. From one thought immediately to the next thought, immediately to the next thought, which shows that it's like a garment. It's something external, the thought. The thought refers to the words, the letters that you're using to think. And these letters are constantly changing, which means that they're not part of the essence. They're always, today you have 1 second you have one thought, the next second you have another thought, and the next second you have another thought, which means that these thoughts are something outside of the person. And also you see that you're able to think about things that don't really have substance. Just baseless things that don't take much thinking, much intellect to think about. Which means that it doesn't actually take you to your intellect, which is one with you, to power these thoughts. These thoughts just come even for empty things, even for things that are nothing. And that is the outer level of thought, the thought that is not one with you. And then that's the first kind of thought. The second kind of thought is the thought, the words of the thought, which are actually part of you, which are actually one with you. As you see that as soon as you have an idea, immediately words are born with that idea. And these words, are one with an idea which actually is one with you. The idea, in essence, is part of you. Your intellect is part of you. And thus, you see that immediately as the intellect comes out, words come out with it. The thought comes out with the intellect at the same time, which is not the thoughts that we mentioned earlier, which is something outside of you. This kind of thought is actually part of you. So he explains that the godly soul is one with, what does it mean that the godly soul is from God's thought? This, not the first level of thought, but the second level of thought. The level of thought that is one with God's intellect and thereby also one with God himself. And that's also what it says, that there's three knots that tie into each other. There's the Jewish people, the Torah, and God. The Torah would refer to thoughts. The Torah is God's wisdom. And the Jewish people are also part of these thoughts. And they are both one with God himself. And therefore, through the Torah, every single Jew actually connects to God. Kedichtiv, b'ni bechor Yisrael, banim atem lahavai Elohechem. So now moving this further, this example, what's the exact idea of thought? So now we're going to explain it first as follows. It says in the verse, my eldest son is Israel. That's the first verse. The second verse says that you are sons, your children, I should say, to your God, to God your God. So, in other words, the verse says that the Jewish people are God's children. Pirush kemo shehaben nimshach mimoach ha'av, kach keviyachol nishmat kol ish Yisrael nimshecha mimachshavto v'chokhmato yitbarech. So now, a child comes originally from the father's thought. And there's the old biology to explain this, and there's the new biology to explain this. The way that the biologists used to think this worked was that the father would have a thought, and that thought would actually develop into something physical in the body, and come down to a more physical form until it actually turned into physical seed. And from that seed came the child. And the new biologist would explain a little bit differently that it's not exactly from the thought itself that it's formed, the seed is formed, but instead the thought actually caused the seed to be produced. The thought caused the body to work and produce seed. But either way you look at it, whether the old biology or the new biology, the point over here is the same, that the father's thought is what actually caused, it's the source for the origin for the actual seed, which turned out to actually be the child, which means that child, after it's born and after it comes into the world and becomes into a person, a body, it still has the same source that it had before. Its source is in the father's thought. And the more that it thinks and digs back to its source and connects itself to its source, in that source over there he reveals, he'll see that him and his father are really one. And so too it says, that's what our example that we're giving for the Jewish people being the sons, the children of God, that their origin, the godly soul's origin is from God's thought. So what's God's thought? God's thought, it says in the Zohar, that it's not like our thought. We think thoughts that are actually things that are outside of us. Like, for example, one day I learned this level I learn about this wisdom, and then I learn about that wisdom. And as I get older, the more days I learn, the more wisdom is added to me. There's me, there's the wisdom, and it's something additional to me. God's thought is not additional to him. God's thought is one with him. It's almost as if his thought is him. And as we're about to explain, Elohu v'chokhmato echad. Him and his thought are one. U'komoshakotev Rambam, as Maimonides explains, the shehu hamada v'hu hayodea chulu, that he is the thing that is known, he is the basis of knowledge, and he is the one that knows the knowledge. God's thought and him are one. He and his thought are one and the same. So we're going to go to the footnote on the side. So the Kabbalists all agreed with the Rambam, with Maimonides, in this statement, even though there were a few that actually argued with the Rambam, like the Maharal, and there is an explanation to their explanation that there's nothing, that you're limiting God by saying that him and his thought are one. But most of the Kabbalists agree with the Rambam, saying that God and his thought are one. So that is now referring to technically the level of the ability to limit in God, which is in other words referred to as the vessels, the kelim, that God and his wisdom, which would refer to the ability to have wisdom, are one. As going to explain later in the second part of Tanya, I believe it's chapter 11, if I'm not mistaken, chapter 10, not sure, one of the 10, 11, 12, something, that this is only in the level that is considered the vessels that are able to create thought. But above this level, which we'll call it Atzilut, which is the world which is one with God, where God himself, there's no such reference to wisdom, because God is above wisdom. כמו שכתוב במקום אחר שאין סוף ברוך הוא מרומם מתרס רוממות אין קץ למעלה מעלה ממהות ובחינת חוכמה מדעת שמות בחינת חוכמה מדעת החשבת כסי הגוף הניתן אצלו כמו שכתוב כולם מחוכמה עשית, that God himself is infinitely higher than wisdom, and to the extent that wisdom is considered like action to him. In other words, God is beyond definitions. Once you say something about God, you're already limiting him. So we're not talking about the level of God himself, we're talking about the level where God is able to create wisdom. And that is where we say that God and his wisdom are one. To see more about that, see the second part of Tanya, chapters 8, 9, and 10, and 11, and also see the book by the Mittler Rebbe, which I hope we'll cover also on this YouTube channel, Shar HaYichud, chapter 29. Moving further, so now we quoted the Rambam, who said God and his thought are one. So this is impossible for anyone to actually grasp that, because we all grasp wisdom in a different way than God grasps wisdom. For us, wisdom is something outside of us. For God, wisdom is something that is one with him, as I explained before. The verses say, if you seek God, will you find him? And his thoughts are not, or God is saying about himself, my thoughts are not your thoughts. So now, this is true that the source of every godly soul is God's thought, which is one with him. And therefore, every godly soul is one with God. But nevertheless, once the souls come out and into creation, they come into a variety of different levels. Some souls are greater than other souls. Some souls are more connected than other souls. Some souls have certain characteristics that other souls don't have. כמו גודל מעלת נשמת האבות ומשה רבינו עליו השלום על נשמת תוכתנו אלה דיקווה משיחה שמחיר תקווה ממש לגבי המוח והראש. Like the difference between the greatness of the souls of the forefathers and Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, their souls were much greater than the souls of our generation, which the souls of our generation are compared to the heels, because throughout the stretch of history, there's one soul that combines all of our souls. All of the Jewish godly souls are combined in one general soul, which is the soul of Adam. That's what it says in the Medrash, that from all the souls came from Adam's soul. And Adam is a form starting from head to toe. Now, as anyone can see, there's much more energy in the head than there is in the lower parts of the body. The lower you go in the body, the less energy there is. The brain has the most amount of energy, and the body has a much more limited amount of energy, and the legs have the least amount of energy, or I should say really the coarsest energy. And the heels and the feet and the heels have the least amount of energy than the whole body. And therefore you can actually see, for example, that when you take a bunch of hot water, it's going to be a lot easier to put your foot in the hot water than put your head in the hot water, because your head feels a lot more pain. It has more energy. So that's how the longer history goes, the closer we get to the time of Mashiach, the lower through Adam's body we go. So the first generations of the forefathers, their souls were on the level of Adam's head, which was a much higher level of a soul. And throughout the generations, the souls come from a lower place until our generation, which is the heel, so to speak, which is right before Mashiach, is the lowest level of souls. וכן בכל דור ודור יש ראשי אלפי ישראל שנשמותיהם הם בחינת ראש ומוח לגבי נשמות העמון ועמי הארץ, וכן נפשות לגבי נפשות. And that's true throughout the span of history, and that's also true in every generation. In every generation, the Jewish people are one block, are one form. And you have the souls which are on the level of the head, and then you have the souls which are on the level of the arms, let's say, for example. Then you have souls which are on the level of the heels, which would be like the simple folk. And so too, within every soul, there are different levels, right? There is, in every soul, there's nefesh, ruach, and neshama, which refer to action, speech, and thought. So each soul is also divided into different levels. Ki kol nefesh kulula mi nefesh ruach v'neshama. Okay, so now there are a division of souls, mikol makom, but still, shoresh kol hanefesh ruach v'neshama kula merosh kol hamadregot hatzolf kol darkin hamrubash beguf ami ha'aretz v'kal shebakalim. Still, the source, okay, the origin of all the souls, from the highest level, from the heads, the souls which are on the level of the head, and the souls which are on the level of the heels, which are enclosed in the simple folk and the people that are irreverent, that they don't care about, it's very light in their eyes to do sins and things like that. All of these souls that are divided, nimshach mimoach ha'elyon shi chochma ilah keviyachol, all come from the same origin, which is what? The supernal brain. Speaking about God's thought, which is God's wisdom, so to speak. כמשל הבן הנמשך ממוח האב, שאפילו ציפור נרגליו, נתהוו מטיפה זו ממש, על ידי שהיית חודשים בבטן האם, ויחדו ממדרגה למדרגה, להשתנות ולהתהוות מבין הציפורניים. So for example, the mind is the source, like we said earlier, the mind is the origin for the birth of the child, the mind of the father, and from it come everything in the child. The head of the child, the arms of the child, even the nails of the child, which are the most external parts of the body, come from the same origin, which is that thought of the father. And it comes through being in the mother's womb for 9 months, and it forms and develops until it comes into a more and more developed level. But nevertheless, although it comes in a very developed level, it's still one in its origin. The child's origin, in its origin, it is one with the father's mind. And even now, after the child is born, it has the same origin. That origin of the father's mind, and in that place, the father and son are one. And as the Talmud relates to us in the Tractate of Nida, in page 31a, that there's 3 partners to creating a child: the father, the mother, and God. It says that the father emits a white seed, and from it comes the bones, the sinews, the nail, the brain. And the mother emits a red seed, from which come the skin, the flesh, the hair, the black of the eye. And Hashem blows into the body, a spirit, a soul. It gives it its countenance, the child's countenance. It gives him eyesight, the ability to hear, the ability to speak, the ability to walk, its understanding and wisdom. And what we learn from there, what we see from there, is that the source for this child's nails is from the mind of the father. As it says in the book of Eitz Chaim, which is a Kabbalistic work, that the esoteric principle of the garments of the first person, of Adam, in Gan Eden, where did his garments come from, which were his nails? The nails are the lowest part of the body. They're like a garment almost. They're almost like something outside of the body. Where did that come from? That came from the level of tfuna, which is the level of the mind. V'kacha mamash. So that is our parable to explain the following. V'kacha mamash keviyachol. That is literally, so to speak, בשורש כל הנפש רוח ונשמה של כללות ישראל למעלה, בירידתו ממדרגה למדרגה, על ידי השתלשלות העולמות הצילות בריאה יציר עשייה, מחוכמתו יתברך, כדכתיב כולם בחוכמה עשית, התהוו ממנו נפש רוח ונשמה של עמי הארץ ופחותי הערך. So the source of every single soul, at every single level of every single soul of the Jewish people, above, it came down from level to level through the worlds. As we know, there's different worlds, supernal worlds above our world, and the godly soul actually came down through each one of those worlds, which referred to the 4 worlds of Atzilut, Bria, Yetzir, Asiya. It came down world after world after world. In other words, similar to the seed, physically, spiritually, the soul came from a high level, a very spiritual level, and what it had to do was go through a development, a level of a certain development, going from one higher level to the lower level, to the lower level, to the lower level, so it could develop itself, the soul could develop itself until it could come down into our physical world, the godly soul, into the body of the Jew, even to the simple folk. And now this soul came down so low, but still, עודנה קשורות ומיוחדות בייחוד נפלא ועצום במהותן ועצמותן הראשון שימשך את חוכמה אלה. It's still completely one with its origin. What is its origin? Its origin is God's wisdom. כי יניקת וחיות נפש רוח ונשמה של עמי הארץ ומנפש רוח ונשמה של הצדיקים החכמים חושב בני ישראל שבדורם. As we said before, each generation has its different levels. You have its head, which would refer to the tzaddikim, the righteous men, the wise men, the chachamim, and the heads of the Jewish people. There's the leaders of the Jewish people, and from them, it's a process. So their godly souls give energy to the lower godly souls. So, in other words, every single level of godly soul that exists gets its energy from the godly soul which is higher than it. And those godly souls get their energy from the godly soul which is higher than them. Until you have the highest godly souls, which would be the leaders of the Jewish people, the holy men, the tzaddikim, they have the highest godly souls. And their godly souls are the origin from which came the lower godly souls, as we're about to explain. ובזה יובן מאמר חז"ל על פסוק ולדווקא בו, שכל הדבק בתלמיד חכם מעלה עליו הכתוב כאילו נדבק בשכינה ממש. The sages ask, the verse, first of all, the verse says that we should all cleave to God. So the sages ask, God is a flaming fire. How could we possibly cleave to him? We'll burn up, God forbid. So it says, so they answered, what you should do is cleave to a Talmid Chacham. Attach yourself to a holy man, to a tzaddik, to the leader, one of the leaders of the Jewish people. Attach yourself to him, and then it'll be as if you attached yourself to God himself. And that can be understood by what we explained, that the energy that we get, the life that we get, that our godly soul receives, comes from the leaders of the Jewish people, and it comes down into our godly souls, the lower godly souls. Because alidei dvika betalmidei chachamim, through attaching to the talmidei chachamim, to the leaders, kshurot nefesh ruach v'neshama shel amei haaretz, u'miyuchadet b'mahut הנרישון ושורשם שבחוכמה עילה, שהוא יתברך וחוכמתו אחת והוא המד החולו. Through attaching to a holy man, they connect to their origin, what's their origin? God's wisdom. And we said, like we said before, God's wisdom is one with him. So essentially they're connecting to their origin, and they're connecting what's their origin, God's wisdom, but God himself. Through connecting, through attaching to a holy man, it's as if you're attaching to God himself. והפולשים ומורדים מתלמידי חכמים מניקת נפש רוח ונשמה שלהם מבחינת אחוריים של נפש רוח ונשמת תלמידי חכמים. And now comes an interesting point that he brings in parentheses, that those that go against the leaders of the Jewish people, they still receive their life force from them. The only difference is that they're turning their back away from the leaders of the Jewish people. In other words, it's not that they're disconnecting themselves from their life force, the life force which is that holy man. Because it's impossible to disconnect themselves. You cannot disconnect yourself from your life force, from your source of life. Instead, what you can do is turn your back away from them and not pay attention to them. It's like the prophet Yirmiyahu says that you've I'm paraphrasing, but you've turned your back from God by sinning and so on. It's impossible to disconnect yourself from God. Why? Because God, it creates everything. Everything is connected to God. Everything is one with God. And God fills the earth. So you can't disconnect yourself from God. But through sinning, what are you doing? You're turning your back from God. So that's the same thing with regards to these holy men and those that go against them. They're connected to them, they receive their life, but it's as if they turn their back to them. ומה שכתוב בזוהר ובזוהר חדש, שהאיכך תלוי שיקדש עצמו בשעת תשמיש דווקא. מה שאין כן בני העם מהארץ חולו. So now, the Zohar explains that first of all, we just explained that, beautiful, every single godly soul, every single Jewish godly soul comes from God's wisdom, comes from God himself. So now we have a question. It says in the Zohar that the person's soul is based on their parents' holiness, on how holy their parents are. And if someone's parents are holier, then they're gonna their children are gonna have a greater soul. For example, you have by the holy man, his name was Rabbi Uri from Sterlisk. He said about his father, if his father would have went to the mikvah one time in his life, then he would have had it a much easier to serve God. So we see from there that the parents have such a big effect on their children. And that can be explained as follows. היינו משום שאין לך נפש רוח ונשמה, שאין לה לבוש מנפש דעצמות אבי ואימו. וכל המצוות שעושה, הכל על ידי אותו הלבוש חולו. So, every single soul has a garment from their parents. And anything that a person does, any mitzvahs that he does, it happens through this garment. Even whatever he receives from heaven is based on this garment. This garment now, what is this garment that we're talking about? In other words, we're saying that there's a different thing. There's the godly soul, and then there's the garment that the godly soul actually comes into. What's that garment? A good question. So that garment is explained in one place. I heard it in the name of the Tzemach Tzedek, which was the third Rebbe of Chabad, that this is referring to the level of the animal soul, which is its thoughts. As we're going to see later on, the animal soul is divided into two. You have thoughts, and then you have emotions. So when we're talking about a garment over here that the godly soul comes into, we're talking about the thoughts of the animal soul. Because there's two things. There's the thoughts, and then there's the emotions of the animal soul. The emotions of the animal soul are very coarse and very physical. And they don't have any connection to godliness. The only way that they can receive godliness is through the thoughts. Because the thoughts are more refined. Thoughts are able to understand things that are spiritual. And so that through the animal soul's thoughts, it can actually receive godly thoughts. It can think about God. The animal soul can actually think about God. And once it starts thinking about God, then it can actually have an effect on the emotions. And that's the garment that we're talking about over here, that a child gets from their parents. That is the garment of the animal soul's thought. And it depends on the holiness of the parents, as we just said. Another explanation I've seen is that in order for the godly soul to actually come into the animal soul, there's a little bit of a disconnect if you think about it. The godly soul is godly. It's spiritual. How can it come in to an animal soul, which is physical? The animating soul, animal or animating soul. It's something physical. So that is through a garment. And based on the parents of the child, this garment is going to be either more refined or less refined. As we see clearly, this is the case from the fact that we need to have joy in serving Hashem, or that we need to feel a love for serving Hashem. This joy that you have from serving God has to be felt physically. Yet serving God, having a feeling of God, is spiritual. So going from a spiritual feeling, it needs to come down into a physical feeling of joy. And the same thing is with loving God. God is something spiritual that you love. You love God, which is spiritual. It's not physical. And that needs to come into the physical body. A feeling of love on your heart. Your physical heart should feel that I love God. So you're trying to go from something which is God, which is beyond physicality, and bring it into the physical heart, the physical mind, this feeling of love and joy. So that is only possible to have that transfer from something spiritual to something physical through a garment. And that is the garment that we're talking about over here. And actually, once that child is born, throughout life, the whole service of serving God is actually to refine your garment. Each person has a garment that the soul comes into. And like we said, it depends on the parents. Sometimes this garment's going to be so refined, he won't want to do any sins. Sometimes it's going to be the opposite. But our service in this world is to refine this garment as much as possible, to the fullest. And that actually, now that we're speaking about that, that is the idea of Gehenna, which is hell, for this garment. Because once a person passes away and their soul leaves their body, then it can only go to a higher level, which is heaven, if its garment that it was in this whole time in this world is refined. And if it's not refined, it can't go up to heaven. So hell, Gehenna, is a refining process. Over a certain period of time, a few months, whatever it is, it goes through a refining process. This garment that wasn't successfully refined in this world goes through a process called hell, which is refinement, and refines itself. And then once that garment is refined, then the soul can be elevated with it to the level of heaven. And I'm taking this again from the place I quoted earlier, which is Shar HaEmunah, the book written by the second Rebbe of Chabad, chapter 27. 27. So again, there's a soul, and then there's the garment that the soul comes into. That's the point over here. ואם יקדש את עצמו ימשיך לבוש קדוש לנשמת בנו ואפילו היא נשמה גדולה צריכה לקידוש אביו וכו'. Now even a great soul, it can be a very high soul, a very lofty soul. Like we have souls of Rabbi Akiva, for example, and many great holy men in the past, holy souls, needed to have a refined garment. That means that their parents still need to be holy in order for their garment to be refined. In other words, you can have a garment that's very coarse and not refined with a soul that's so great. אבל הנשמה עצמה הנה לפעמים נשמת אדם גבוה לאין קץ בא להיות בנו של אדם נבזה ושפל חולו. But that holiness of the parents is only an effect on the garment, but not an effect on the soul itself. The godly soul is irrelevant of the parents, the level of the godly soul. And sometimes you see that the soul of someone, a very great soul, can come into someone that's very low. Could come as a child of someone that's very low. And that's a quote from that's taken from the Arizal, who explains this concept. And actually you see that in many instances throughout history where you had these great souls Like, for example, Rabbi Meir, some say that he actually came from a family of Romans, which you can imagine are not so pure, are not so refined. And actually, his soul was such a great soul, Rabbi Meir. And over there you see that actually his great soul came into a garment which was not necessarily so great. Or another example is Rabbi Akiva, who came from a family of, some say, converts, that his soul, which was an extremely great soul, Rabbi Akiva, came into a garment which was not necessarily so great. Or another example, you have the famous Reish Lakish, who actually was a bandit. And so you can imagine, his garment, he was not very refined. If he was a bandit, he couldn't have been so refined. But he turned himself over, and he turned out to be one of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people. And as we see, he had such a great soul, such a high soul that came through. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.